Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining the show for the 100th time, Sam Monson of Pro Football Focus. How do you feel about your 100th appearance on the show, Sam? How are you?
Nice, yeah, it's a good milestone. I assume you've brought some kind of gift to commemorate such an occasion.
Yeah, I got some Justin Jefferson Oakley sunglasses that I
There you
was
go.
wearing on the podcast, so I could send you a pair of those
Perfect.
to commemorate his giganto contract. And I want to get your take on that, all things Minnesota Vikings and just the direction of the team. But I want to ask you a hotter question to begin that you would be able to connect the dots here with the receivers of the Minnesota Vikings history. Where do you think Justin Jefferson will rank on that list when he retires and his jersey is raised into the Vikings Ring of Honor? Will people say the greatest Viking receiver, second, third, fourth? What do you think?
It's a crazy high bar. I mean, this kind of happens every offseason, right? As you eventually somewhere along the offseason, you get into looking at teams' histories at specific position groups, right? Like the Bears have been in existence for like 187 years and have never had a quarterback, or have had one, but it was back in, before black and white TV. The Vikings receivers have been their thing. Like they've got what, three, four now, if you include Jefferson, four of, say, the top 15 wide receivers to ever play the game, which is crazy for one individual franchise. Usually with most teams, you would be saying, well, Jefferson's on track to be the greatest receiver this team's ever had, not even close. For Minnesota, for that to be the case, he needs to be one of the top five wide receivers to ever play the game, because Randy Moss is absolutely in that conversation. I mean, he could be the best receiver ever, depending on how you value longevity versus simply, peak devastating impact. And then I think Chris Carter gets kind of undervalued now with this explosion of, receiving numbers, passing yardage, all these kinds of things. Carter, when he retired, was number two to Jerry Rice. And the longer we go, the further down that list he's going to slide, and the more we're just going to forget what he was. But Chris Carter, I think, has a legitimate case to be one of the top sort of five wide receivers to ever play the game. So Jefferson's got to exceed those guys to be the top guy. I mean, he's on that track. Like, he's in the conversation. It's not unreasonable at this point in his career, but he's definitely got a long way to go before you're willing to give him that kind of credit.
Right. What we've already seen is a peak that is completely dominant. I mean, there are very few times that a wide receiver ever in history has been talked about, even discussed in the MVP conversation like he was in 2022. And what's crazy about just football in general is somebody has a down year or even misses half the year with an injury. It wasn't a down year for Jefferson by the metrics of, his PFF grade, or whether it was his yards per game or yards per touch or target or whatever. It was just that he was dealing with an injury for a part of the season. But if you go back 1 year, I don't know where they are in the 2022 season without Justin Jefferson's performance. Instead of 13-4, it might have been like 7-10 without the way that he played. And it's one of the best wide receiver seasons of all time. The thing about trying to reach the bar of Randy Moss is there is mythology with Randy Moss that's different. Coming from Marshall, dropping in the draft, the whole thing, the 98 season where he explodes on the scene, the Thanksgiving game. Like, what Randy Moss had is these iconic moments that everybody remembers from that era, that also took a franchise that was just sort of flopping around in the wind. It was just middling and average and mediocre, and took them to being one of the best and most exciting teams of all time. It's kind of different with Justin Jefferson. It was a good team, but they didn't win anything in the playoffs. They didn't have a 15-1 season where they were the greatest offense of all time or something like that. So that's going to be pretty tough to top. Like, there's going to be a lot that has to come for him if he's going to get into that conversation.
Yeah, and there's also there's an added layer of kind of legend when a guy has physical traits that are, completely different to everybody else. So, Tyreek Hill is like the best comp for Randy Moss at the moment, because he has that speed and that explosion that nobody else in the NFL can match. Even fast guys look ridiculously slow compared with Tyreek Hill. Like, he has these plays where, he makes up 5 yards on a fast guy just to celebrate with him in the end zone. Like, and he's not going full speed. He's just running along with him. Randy Moss has those plays on his highlight reel where he would just blow past people that could run 4.3, 4.35 and just make them look ridiculous. And then, if the ball arrived in the end zone and you were all over him, he'd still go up and make the catch. And, he literally became a verb. To moss somebody is a thing. There's not many players that get that, right? In NFL history, the number of players that became a verb because of how good they were or how dominant they were at a specific thing is very, very few. So for Jefferson to get to that level, he's not going to do it by, the same way. It's not going to go the same way. He's going to do it by the kind of, Jerry Rice type of route, which is at some point, the numbers and the production and everything just becomes overwhelming and you can't argue with it anymore. But yeah, the Randy Moss thing is a very unusual pathway to immortality.
Well, in the way that the game was played at the time, there was just a lot more downfield passing than there is in the NFL now. I remember looking this up when we were talking about JJ McCarthy's deep ball and things like that, and how important is that. And a lot of quarterbacks, 10, 12% of their passes are traveling more than 20 yards, where even if you go back to the 90s, a lot of it was run the football, play action, throw it, 20 yards down the field, that the explosive plays were what they were looking for in that era. And then you have a guy who was so much better physically than anyone else. He would just run by everyone. And I'm not saying that now they would have an answer necessarily for Randy Moss. Maybe the gap of athleticism would be closed between him and the corners and the plans would be a little better, but they get after the quarterback so fast now that I don't know that you can run as many routes that were going down the field like that. So the best wide receivers most of the time have to do their work in the intermediate areas. We saw this from Davante Adams for so many years with Aaron Rodgers, where the guy's running a 12-yard out or something, and that's, hey, look at this domination from Davante Adams. And Jefferson kind of has that same thing where it's not like they're just dropping back, heaving the ball 40 yards up in the air, and he's just jumping over people. It's a lot more of a precision type of thing, his route running, his ability to catch anything in the vicinity. And I think that's just a product of kind of how things have changed, where teams have tried to play much more two deep safeties and offenses have responded by scheming with shorter stuff. So maybe there's more of a conversation with him and Chris Carter, who was not necessarily the deep bomb type of guy.
Right. Yeah, it would look different, I think, if Randy Moss came into the NFL today, because, as you say, certainly in the last couple of years, teams have really, really gone after those explosive plays, those vertical plays. But it's been a trend, for years moving in that direction. And I think Randy Moss was actually a part of that. Like, teams had to figure out different coverages because you couldn't just leave him one-on-one on the outside with a safety in the middle of the field. Like, you needed help over the top for Randy Moss. Otherwise, it was a touchdown. There was nothing you could do about it because nobody existed that could run with him, so you needed those kind of coverage shells to bracket Randy Moss, to take him away. I think if Moss came into the NFL now, it would look more like sort of 2004 Randy Moss, right? It would be more of that higher volume, where he did work the middle of the field. He did work intermediate. He did work short a lot more, and showed that, like, that. I think that's one thing that he probably doesn't get fair credit for, is he could do that as well. It's just earlier in his career, you didn't need to, because nobody was prepared for what he could do. So every other catch was a 50-yard bomb. And, you didn't need the rest of the stuff. Chris Carter and Jake Reed or whatever could do that. Just let Randy Moss run for 50 yards and score. So I think if he came into the league now, it would look more like that late Vikings career, late Vikings era of Moss. But yeah, that gets into the kind of Chris Carter range. I think it's amazing that Jefferson at this point has already exceeded, other amazing receivers that the Vikings have had, like Adam Thielen, like Stephon Diggs, like Anthony Carter, who himself is another guy that gets wildly underrated. Like, Jefferson at this point, I think, has already eclipsed those guys. And the only ones sort of left on the list are Chris Carter and Randy Moss, who are not just, two of the greatest receivers to ever play, but obviously played, a full career that put them at Hall of Fame level. Like, simple longevity is what's separating them from Jefferson as much as anything else at this point.
Now let's get into the other part of the conversation with Jefferson here, the more newsworthy, which is the contract extension that he signs. I have used all the snark I've got about the rumors and everything else. And when we're talking about a player that the only comps we have in history of the Vikings are Moss and Carter, they weren't going to trade that player because you don't trade that player. And it didn't exactly work out trading Randy Moss either. So, when it comes to this contract with Justin Jefferson, though, it resets the market by kind of a ton, especially when it comes to that fully guaranteed money, which he just blew everybody else out of the water with what he has there. Looking at the contract from your perspective, how do you think that they can work around this? Do you feel like it's restrictive? Is it approaching quarterback money? Or do you look at it as this shouldn't be a huge problem for their team building going forward?
Yeah, well, I'm with you generally in that when you find a player that good, that transcendent, don't trade him away ever. And specifically the Vikings, because they did it already with Randy Moss. Okay, completely different front office, completely different franchise, but it's institutional memory, right? The team collectively remembers that they had one of these guys already, and okay, he may have been a pain in the ass, and they had to navigate, some manufactured controversy or other every year or every other year. And they eventually got tired of it, but you traded him away and it went terribly, right? And it went terribly for everybody. Like nobody benefited from trading away Randy Moss at any point in his career. You don't get better by doing that. And teams have done it. Other teams like the Kansas City Chiefs traded away Tyreek Hill. It is the type of move that NFL teams will still make. But I think the Vikings of all teams would very much not have made that move because of the Randy Moss history. And I think generally it's the right approach. Like the whole purpose of the draft and of, doing this is to find guys like that are so special. They change the rules and they change games. And yeah, there's at some point, there's a sort of value proposition of what you can get back for them. But when they're that good, the chances of you ever actually achieving that and even being better in the aggregate when you add up all the draft picks and all the players that it became, they're so small. I mean, look at the Raiders trading away Khalil Mack. Like theoretically, the analytics would say that was the right move, right? They were on the right side of that trade, but it didn't turn out that way. They made a complete mess of the draft picks that they got. And even if you say, okay, that was, a particularly special Raiders front office in terms of blowing draft picks, I don't know that even the average would have ended up better than Khalil Mack because he was that good at the time. So I think you find a way to keep him. And in particular, I think the Vikings are well positioned to do so because they just got away from the Kirk Cousins contract, right? That's the flexibility that you get back from having a rookie quarterback contract. And they're going to kind of coincide relatively neatly, right? So that the majority of the pain for Justin Jefferson's contract is going to come with the cheaper deal, the cheaper years of JJ McCarthy's deal. It's now sort of done early enough that even when the years are painful, if they re-up JJ McCarthy for a big money second contract, they've got such a far runway to plan for that it's doable. And in today's sort of salary cap era, I think you have space for one of those deals, right? You have space for the big money quarterback deal, one other market resetting monster contract, and then everything else, is done relatively cheaply or like that. But you're not, there's enough flexibility in the NFL salary cap that you can actually put quite a lot in there and still be fine, right? And still, you're never, it's going to condition what you do with the rest of the roster. You're going to have to make some tough decisions somewhere down the line. And there will be players that you would like to have kept in normal circumstances that you're going to have to say, sorry, we're going to try and find, a number 2 corner in the draft instead of paying you, $20 million a year or whatever. But it's worth it, right? Because you kept Justin Jefferson, because you kept one of the top 5 players in all of football on your team and have him, supporting the young quarterback and all those things.
Yeah, and I think about just in general, overall with football, every situation has its own context. So we like to try to find these blanket things that we could apply to everything. Like, don't pay anybody, just keep getting draft picks and so forth. But when you're talking about a team that doesn't have too many expensive players, that doesn't have too many old players at this point, because they made a concerted effort to fix the salary cap before they had to do this, including moving on from Kirk Cousins. And then next year, even the way they set up his deal, his dead money is going to be off the books for
Right.
next year. So it opens up all this extra space to have JJ McCarthy as the cheap guy and one expensive, super expensive wide receiver. But the rest of the team, it's not like they're losing a bunch of free agents after next year. There's a couple of guys who are hitting free agency, but they have set themselves up with a window, even with the structure of Jefferson's deal, where the first year, this year is, I think, around 8 million. Then they could carry over some of that cap. Then it goes up to 15, not very restrictive. And then there's a pretty clear restructure situation in the third year of it. And so eventually you go, wait, is he ever going to have a salary cap hit of 35 million? The answer is probably not, actually. And it's like AJ Brown's deal, where he's making 32 million a year, and there's nothing on there that says he'll ever have 32 million, because if you do it a certain way, it's not like you can completely get around it, but you can make it manageable through these years, especially while McCarthy is young.
Right. And even if, I tend to think of we always sort of think of these deals and the roster management part of football in abstractions, right? Like but even in abstractions, I think it makes sense, right? If you wipe the thing clean and you said, right, we're starting a franchise from scratch, how would you allocate your resources around the roster? What would it look like? Obviously, your biggest money, your first priority is quarterback. That's the most important thing. And if we don't have that, almost nothing else matters. That's what you focus on first. So, whether it's the draft, whether it's your big money guy that you've already settled on, the free agent, whatever, you get your quarterback. That's where the majority of your resources goes. And then you've got like 4 or 5 or 6 other big money contracts to invest, depending on exactly how big they are. And I give Detroit a ton of respect right now. Like, look at what they're doing with all these extensions. They are literally going through and saying, we've got the quarterback on his big money contract. Now we want his number one wide receiver locked down. We want our best offensive lineman locked down. We want our best defensive lineman locked down. That'll be Aiden Hutchinson, up next down the line. They're literally going through exactly what we're talking about. They're finding the most important positions, and they're giving those guys the biggest long-term contract and locking them down. That's exactly what you would want to do. And, that's what the Vikings have done. Like, Jefferson is literally the first player that you would want outside of the quarterback, tied down, locked up, given the big money to keep him in the building. So it makes perfect sense.
So just in general, the wide receiver market exploded this offseason, which helped Jefferson get to 35 million because he could look at the other wide receivers who signed for big money. Is wide receiver, if you were ranking all the positions by positional value, is that number one outside of quarterback to you?
I think so. Yeah. Like, PFF data has suggested that for a while. Intuitively, it makes sense. When you think about it a bit, it's the one position I think that is most able to dictate the impact that they have on the game and is less dependent on, everything other than the quarterback. But like, everyone used to see it as the top tier pass rusher. I think that's probably next. But top tier pass rushers, we've seen not last year, the year before. Look at the difference between 2022 Myles Garrett and 2023 Myles Garrett. Same guy, but less help around him. You could take him out of the game, right? He was still a problem, but you could minimize the impact that Myles Garrett had on the game. 2023, you get Zadarius Smith in the building, you get Dalvin Tomlinson, you get more help around him, you get Jim Schwartz, with a better scheme, and suddenly Myles Garrett is Defensive Player of the Year. I don't know that he played significantly better. It's just that the help around him suddenly turbocharged the impact that he could have on the game. Corner is a similar thing, right? You can have an elite corner, but if you have nothing up front, that guy is going to get annihilated. Look at Patrick Surtain last year. Denver's defense was like historically inept for the first half of the season. So Surtain gave up some catches and gave up some yardage. And, Devontae Adams says Surtain is the best corner in the game, but you didn't see it because everything else around him was bad. Wide receiver, I think, is the least dependent position, where if that guy's just amazing, he's going to have production, right? Tyreek Hill can go anywhere and put up ridiculous yardage because you can't cover him, whether it's deep, whether it's intermediate, underneath, gimmick plays, design catches. Even if the offensive line stinks, you can get the ball in his hands quickly. He can make plays. He can make an impact on the game. So I think it makes sense for wide receiver. Like, quarterback is the most valuable position in the game. Second most valuable is his favorite target.
I think we all understand that circumstances around a quarterback will dictate a lot of quarterbacks' production. If it's Patrick Mahomes, yes, you can move on from Tyreek Hill. Would not suggest, though, for anybody else. And on the other side of that, that's one of those situations where whoever wants to make whatever argument can use Tyreek Hill, because you could say, now, wait a minute, wasn't Tua just pretty mediocre in Miami and then suddenly amazing last year? And who was that because of? Maybe Tyreek Hill. It is a chicken and the egg thing when it comes to a wide receiver and a quarterback and how much they affect each other. The Brock Purdy arguing people, bless them. They got a lot of content out of debating whether Brock Purdy was actually good or not. I think there's no debating, though, whether Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and Trent Williams helped that. So you want to be in that situation if you're the Vikings. But the question is, if they're going to start Sam Darnold, how much does Justin Jefferson make Sam Darnold potentially a starting caliber quarterback, which he has not been in the past? And how much does he weigh the odds that JJ McCarthy can become very good?
Yeah, and even the Tyreek Hill thing, by the way, it's not like that worked for Kansas City. Like, they almost didn't win Super Bowls because they didn't have receivers. Like, they came up just big enough right at the end that the best quarterback in the NFL and one of the best of all time already, paired with a great offensive line and one of the best head coaches of all time, almost didn't win Super Bowls because they didn't have a reliable wide receiver. And they got bailed out late last season by, Rashee Rice's emergence and all those kinds of things. So on the one hand, he clearly made Tua and the Miami Dolphins a much better offense. And I don't think you can sort of look at the other side and say, well, it's win-win. Everybody did well at that. Like, Kansas City didn't. They are still trying to recover. It's why they've gone and got Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy this offseason. Like, they are trying to recover from the loss of Tyreek Hill still. And okay, it allowed them have the money to, lock other guys down. But, you still very clearly saw the impact of losing a receiver like Tyreek Hill in the offense. Yeah, look, Jefferson obviously is amazing. They've got Addison as well. Like, this is a good receiving core. If Hawkinson comes back healthy, it should be a good offense again. And it's probably the best situation, obviously, outside of San Francisco, where, he didn't really get an opportunity, certainly long term, that Darnold has had. It's a good offensive scheme. It's a good system. It's a good support structure across the board. It's as good a situation as he's ever been in the NFL. Now, whether or not he has it, whether or not he has the ability to play at that level consistently, I think is still entirely up for debate. Even in his college career, the thing that kind of made him the prospect, it was still wildly inconsistent. Like, I think people overlook that element of Sam Darnold, that it's not like the USC career was just one constant dominant ride. Like, even then it was streaky and patchy and had some bad in it as well. So yeah, I think we've seen the last couple of years, the impact that support system has on a quarterback, and if it's terrible, like Chicago with Justin Fields, like Carolina with Bryce Young last year, it can ruin the guy and there's just no shot. And similarly, if you make it really, really good, you can prop up, a lot of quarterbacks. And in today's NFL, there's one Patrick Mahomes and there's two or three other guys that are amazing and incredible and going to drag whatever team to the playoffs almost regardless of what's around them. But you can get quite a long way to bridging the gap towards that guy if you take a reasonable quarterback, of which I think there have never been more, right? Like, there have never been more Baker Mayfields or Kirk Cousins or, those guys in the NFL. If you take one of those guys and surround him with as much talent as possible, I think you can get pretty close to the level of Josh Allen, with a worse supporting cast.
All right, so I'm going to play a little game with you here. Do you like the Price is Right? Are you Price is Right guy?
Well, I mean, like is
you're familiar with it. You're familiar with it. You understand what it is. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start raising the potential PFF grade of Sam Darnold, starting with what he's been in his career, and then I'm going to move it up. And you tell me when to stop. what you think he would have if he played the entire season with Jefferson, Addison, Hockenson comes back. So where he's been most of his career is about 60, which is being generous to say it's a like mediocre replacement level. Well, maybe he could be a 65 if he's playing with these guys. He could potentially even be a 70 out of 100 here, PFF grade, if he plays pretty well. Maybe even if Justin Jefferson's really great, fully healthy, 75. Now, what Vikings fans think he's good. Okay, all right, there it is.
then we tap out. I think 75 is a realistic target for somebody like Sam Darnold in that offense with those receivers, with all the things we just mentioned. I would be reluctant to go higher than that. I think higher than that, you're getting into pretty high level NFL play. You're getting into my baseline would be, where is he relative to Kirk Cousins, with a similar environment, right? He's nowhere near the caliber of quarterback Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins has been the kind of high 70s, low 80s, and higher than that, depending on his best season, up to kind of 85 and threatening the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Darnold, I don't think is ever going to get there. But I think you could get him somewhere, in the mid 70s, which is the sort of decent, half decent year of Baker Mayfield type of play. Like, I think Baker last year was 76, something like that for the Bucs. That's a reasonable target, I think.
I think so too. And if there was some combination of games where he graded a 40 and games where he graded an 85 or something, I wouldn't really be terribly shocked, having watched the last few games that he played in Carolina, where one of them he was downright spectacular. Another one, I think he had a quarterback rating of 5 or something like that. So I think it's going to be a bit of a wild ride with him regardless. There's some Jameis Winston element to him where I don't think it can be contained that he's going to do crazy stuff. But the high end of it, having watched him thrown a football in OTAs a few times, you could tell there's no secret why he was drafted as high as he was picked. And with this offense, that will, I think, work well for him with Kevin O'Connell in his ear. And, we'll see where it goes from there. But would you want JJ McCarthy to play sooner than later or later than sooner?
To me, it's always just, is it going to do him harm? Right. Like, I think that I generally believe that you need development on the field. There's a school of thought now with this sort of Jordan Love, Aaron Rodgers transition plan, where maybe you can teach them everything they need over like 2-3 years on the sideline. And maybe that's true, but I don't think it necessarily works for half a season or 3/4 of the season. Like, I think at that point, if that's the timeline you're working with, all within one kind of calendar year, one cycle, you need him on the field to get that development going. You need the live reps. You need the first team reps. You need him to be the guy. And the only time I think you would change that is if you think it's actually going to do him harm being put out there. Like Carolina last year, I don't know that helped Bryce Young at all. That was bad. It didn't get any better. We never sort of saw him pull himself through the other side of that and start improving. That was just suffering through a bad season. And maybe that's fine. Maybe it's not going to do him any harm, but there's definitely a risk that was irreparable damage to whatever Bryce Young's NFL career is going to be. So that would be my determining factor. Like, if you think, and this is a good situation, so if you think he's ready enough to go out there and not, embarrass himself, not just get stuck in quicksand and start seeing ghosts like Sam Darnold way back when. If you think he's capable of doing that, then throw him out there. And even if he struggles, even if there's some bad plays, there's some bad games in there, ultimately that's what he needs to become the player he's going to be. And it's really, Darnold is there if you need him, not like because I don't think you use that as, McCarthy's start date depends on what Darnold is doing. Like, Darnold is just there if you need him to play for an indeterminate length of time, but McCarthy is the variable.
Right. Yeah. And that's why you get Sam Darnold to take the pressure off of JJ McCarthy to feel like he's ready. The biggest thing for me is that if the quarterback can throw the ball on time with the way the offense is designed, I don't really care if he flies some balls into the stands because his accuracy isn't there yet, or if he underthrows some deep balls and gets them picked. But if he's holding on to the ball too long because he can't see where he's supposed to throw it yet or doesn't understand the offense, or he's not setting the protections. And this is where with Bryce Young, I was like gobsmacked that Harrison Smith walks up to the line of scrimmage and is right there. They don't send anybody over to try to shift the protection to him. And he just walks in and smashes Bryce Young and sacks. Like, this is not working. He's not ready to be able to do this yet, or something about that offense isn't. That's the risk of confidence. That's the risk of injury that you take. I think Justin Fields got beat up a ton early on and his confidence was harmed because he didn't know what he was doing out there and couldn't see the field. So they have to be ready for him to be able to throw on time and get rid of the football. And then the rest, the results don't matter quite as much in that first year if he's going to play. On the bigger picture matter, as long as you and I have known each other, we talked about, this franchise is kind of stuck in the mud and just their history is them being middling. And how do they escape the Kirk Cousins contract? What can they do? Sign a nose tackle? And now we are in a different place. Maybe this changes our friendship, Sam. Maybe we're different now because of this. It is such a different place, though, where this franchise stands right now.
We're in a post Kirk Cousins landscape for the first time. Look, it's a new world. Like, they might not be any better this year, but for the first time since the Kirk Cousins signing, there's a different level of hope because now you've at least gone and like Kirk Cousins put a fairly clear ceiling on what this team was going to be. Unless you could assemble a championship caliber roster around him, Cousins was unlikely to ever take you to a Super Bowl. Maybe you would catch lightning in a bottle and you would get like that 5-game sequence where Cousins plays like an all-pro, and that was the way you were going to make it happen, but that never materialized. So ultimately, you were always stuck at this level of being too good to ever get a great draft pick, but not good enough to really contend because Cousins was your quarterback. Now, you've gone in a different direction. JJ McCarthy comes in. The chances, like, it's a very high bar to be as good as Kirk Cousins. Like, let's make that clear. He's a really good quarterback. It's like there's a reason Atlanta gave him that kind of money because they just had Desmond Ridder. Like, they just saw how hard it is to have a Kirk Cousins caliber quarterback. But for the first time, the ceiling is higher now, right? Because you might get a quarterback that's better than Kirk Cousins, and you're not paying him the same money as you had before. So you can do things like lock up Justin Jefferson long-term. So, for the first time in years, there is a different level of hope attached to the Vikings because we no longer know where the ceiling is of this team. And maybe it is lower than what it was with Kirk Cousins, but it might be higher as well. And that's the first time that has been an unknown variable for years.
Yeah, and there's, I think, a recognition of that with the fans that this year might not result in a deep playoff run, but it could be kind of a transition into something that is a totally different era. How would you evaluate Kwesi Adofo-Mensah now that we've seen his plan come to fruition? Because when the analytics GM gets hired, you go, what's he going to do? Is he going to just do some crazy stuff? Like, is he going to analytics the football? What's going to happen here? And I don't think that he analytics the football and did a bunch of stuff that was way off of the beaten trail of what normal teams do, so much as he followed the path of teams that have succeeded in the NFC, which is the Philadelphia, San Francisco are the two best in recent years. Quarterbacks on rookie contracts, stacking up rosters, acquiring playmakers in drafting Jordan Addison and getting TJ Hawkinson. It hasn't been something insane. It's kind of been exactly what he said it was going to be. We're going to go from point A to point B to turn over this roster to get it to a good place. But how would you look at that operation over the last 3 years?
I've always thought that he was sort of labeled incorrectly, as this analytics GM. It's not like he doesn't have an analytics background, but his deeper background is finance, right? Like he's a Wall Street guy at heart. He's a finance GM. And when you start looking at what he values and what he's done, it sort of makes more sense almost in financial terms. Like he places a real value in blue chip stocks, right? He goes after locking down Justin Jefferson long-term, but also the way that they aggressively traded up for Dallas Turner, right? They view Dallas Turner as this blue chip stock. He's Apple, he's Microsoft, right? You want to go and get that when it's available or when you think you have a shot at it, even if you have to overpay slightly, because that's the thing that's going to return bigger dividends down the line, right? and then also sort of, spreading out the risk and combating that by doing some other things that are a little bit more on the analytic side of things. So I think overall, you see a guy who isn't going to stick with, what the analytics book would say every single time. He's not going to do, a religious slave to that, because the sort of financial side of him also ties, like it's kind of closer in nature, I think, to that old school football guy mentality, which is, really place value in these important players, these guys that are amazing. And it's sort of, there's a natural synergy there. So I think ultimately it's going to shake out as a guy that, has some old school attitudes towards things, but also has enough, new age analytics approach to kind of modify that and still not necessarily the best of both worlds, but there will be elements of both in his strategy kind of at all times.
Where the finance thing has really come up big for him is in moving on from certain players that weren't worth it, even if you really liked them. Danielle Hunter is an example. Nobody is more loved than Danielle Hunter, but a fully guaranteed 2-year contract for somebody who's got neck issues and you have a lot of weaknesses on defense, it's not really a good play. It doesn't give you a lot of flexibility on the salary cap like Jonathan Grenard's deal does. And Dalvin Tomlinson is another one where they just went, yeah, we love you at defensive tackle. We don't love you at that price, so we're going to move on. And then Kirk Cousins as well, although I think that was always the plan, was to move on during this year where there was a lot of good draft pick quarterbacks. But even then, it was line in the sand. This is what we would pay for Kirk Cousins. This is what we would not pay for Kirk Cousins. And they ended up, I think, better off because of it. What is your hottest June? We're recording this on June 4th. June 4th NFL take. What is that when you're doing the podcast, you're arguing with Steve? What could you get heated about on June 4th?
June, nothing. That's the thing. We've reached the point where there is nothing in today's NFL in June the 4th that I can get. Actually, no. What was I ranting about yesterday?
I was going to say, I listened to the show. I think there's any time this is possible.
Trayvon Walker. People are claiming that Trayvon Walker is actually a phenomenal player now because he had double-digit sacks and somebody claimed he was elite against the run. Only one of those two things is true, and it's the one that doesn't necessarily mean he's good. Vic Beasley had double-digit sacks one year, and it was like, oh, Vic Beasley's arrived, and then he bounced out of the NFL within a couple of years. Like Trayvon Walker has not become anything like the player that you would say not just justifies the number one overall pick, but even justifies taking him over Aiden Hutchinson, which seemed ridiculous at the time. And the longer it goes on, looks even more ridiculous. Aiden Hutchinson is like right on the cusp of defensive player of the year kind of caliber. And Trayvon Walker is marginally better, if any, than the player they drafted at number one overall, who was just a collection of unique physical tools yet to become a football player.
Okay, so there, a Jaguars defensive end. You're like, I don't know, I couldn't get upset about anything, and then you just threw a chair over Trayvon Walker. I'll give you a real quick one before you go for me that I've been talking so much Justin Jefferson contract, everything else, haven't brought it up. One narrative that I see out there all the time this offseason is, what are the Cowboys doing? What are the Cowboys doing? They're just letting this all slip through their fingers and everything else. Missing a lot of perspective, I think, on how good that roster is and the fact that they added Mike Zimmer as their defensive coordinator, which having had an up close look at Mike Zimmer and his mind of defense, I think is a pretty darn good move for them. And it just seems like people desperate to talk about the Cowboys in some way, but they didn't do anything exciting. So they're mad at them. Like, well, you guys were supposed to do some crazy move in the offseason and you didn't. So now I have nothing to talk about. That team is a behemoth, and I still think they should be a favorite despite the fact that they choke in the playoffs.
Yeah, but it's also conditioned on two things. Number one, that Jerry Jones immediately after failing again was like, we're all in this year. You're like, well, okay, if you're all in, then what is this? This is not all in. I don't know if you know what that term means, but this is not all in. This is something completely different. So that's number one. And number two, it's also conditioned by the fact that as good as they have been, they do keep failing at the same hurdle every single year. So if you're not doing something dramatically different, like I think I'm a reasonable advocate for Like if you're good enough at a certain level, just keep knocking on the door and eventually it'll open, right? I think Buffalo, you can make that case for. But I think it's different for Dallas because this is not like they're not failing because they've just been unlucky in these games. Like they're getting there and the weight of history is crushing them and they're choking, right? It's a different outcome. So it feels like you need to do something dramatically different. And instead, what they've sort of done is relied on the other element I think that I have concerns with is, yeah, it's a great roster. And they let a lot of guys leave and they've replaced them with draft picks, which is generally not a bad strategy, but they actually need the rookies to replace those guys now, right? And step in immediately and replace good players. Like Tyron Smith is going to be replaced by a rookie left tackle who was drafted not in the top 10, who's, seen as a something of a project and is going to need to be like a high level left tackle right out of the gate. Otherwise they downgraded. Tyler Biadasz, the center, is probably going to need to be replaced by the rookie, maybe Cooper Beebe, who comes in. Like either way, that offensive line is going to have to shuffle and have a rookie in there. Again, chances of that guy hitting the ground running and being as good as Biadasz right away, not great. You're probably downgraded there. So they've done that at like multiple spots across the team. And, to their credit, they've been one of the better drafting teams in recent years, but they're really testing that this year. Like they need to have serious contributions from like 3 or 4 draft picks to just be as good as they were a year ago, which, let's remember, wasn't good enough. So I think that is the driving force behind the narrative, is like clearly where you were has not been good enough to do what you need to do. And it's not immediately obvious that you're any better than you were this time a year ago.
No, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that the baseline that they've put up, if they even do it again, you go into the playoffs again as a favorite, and then I can't control it from there if they just completely fall apart. But I think that Zimmer does give them a better chance not to do that defensively, at least in the first round of the playoffs. But it might be a fun game for us sometime in the summertime to just give you a random position group from every team, no notes, and you have to give a take on it, because I was just like, yeah, I don't know about these Cowboys. And you you covered everything. So anyway, that's what you do. Sam Monson, PFF NFL show. Everybody already knows it, with Steve Palazzolo. We will get together again soon, man, but always great to now have these conversations in the post Kirk era. It's fresh that now you don't have to roll your eyes when I send you an email and say, hey, you want to come on the show? Now I got to talk about how they're going to fill out the left guard again.